Good afternoon and welcome to this National Transportation Safety Board's Most Wanted List webinar, Collision Avoidance Technology and Teen Driver Safety. Thank you for joining us. We're meeting virtually today because motor vehicle crashes are the second leading cause of death for teens. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2019, approximately 2,400 teens in the United States aged 13 through 19 were killed in motor vehicle crashes. That is an average of about 7 teens killed every single day. Mile for mile, teen drivers are nearly 4 times more likely to crash than drivers over 20 years old, and more likely to be involved in a fatal crash than any age group except those over 80. The NTSB has recently launched multiple crashes involving teen drivers. These investigations are active and ongoing, so we cannot comment further on those crashes today. However, they underscore the importance of improving teen driver safety. Historically, we've discussed many safety messages with our teen drivers. Put down the phone, don't drink and drive, focus on the road, and slow down. These safety messages rely on our teen drivers to make the safe decision. However, the decision-making capabilities of our youngest drivers are not as robust as mature adults. Even among the most well-intentioned teen drivers, mistakes can and do happen. Today, we'll discuss how collision avoidance technologies can help compensate or provide a backstop for those inevitable mistakes. The primary goal of any collision avoidance technology is to prevent and mitigate the severity of crashes by detecting a conflict, alerting the driver, and, when necessary, automatically braking. The NTSB began advocating for collision avoidance technologies beginning in 1995. In a 2015 special investigation report, the NTSB issued recommendations to all automakers to make forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking standard in all vehicles. Additionally, require collision avoidance and connected vehicle technologies in all vehicles is on the 2021-2022 NTSB Most Wanted List. According to a study from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, a comprehensive suite of collision avoidance technology and teen driver-specific technology could prevent or mitigate 41% of all crashes involving teen drivers, and as many as 47% of teen driver injuries and 78% of teen driver deaths. The NTSB believes safety is a shared responsibility and it must be collaborative. We must all work together to improve road safety, especially for our young people. Today, I've invited a number of experts who will discuss the role of collision avoidance technologies in improving teen driver safety. Our presenters today include Alexandra Mueller from IIHS to describe their new study on the benefits of collision avoidance technology for teens. Paul Scaglione from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation to discuss what automakers are doing to advance teen driver safety. William Van Tassel from AAA National to represent the driver's education perspective from a national level. Nadine Anderson from NREX will provide an equity perspective on new vehicle technology. And finally, we have Rob Malloy from the NTSB Office of Highway Safety to discuss the agency's recommendations, how to increase adoption of collision avoidance technologies, and potentially pitfalls of over-reliance. In the second half of today's program, our experts will join in a Q&A session on collision avoidance and teen drivers so we can learn more about how to use these technologies to improve teen safety and save lives. We want to identify obstacles and generate solutions that can work for everyone. I'm excited for the presentations and our conversation today. So without further ado, my first guest is Alexandra Mueller. Alexandra Mueller is a research scientist at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, IIHS. Dr. Mueller joined the Institute in 2017 and conducts research on the usability and safety of driver assistance technologies in driving automation. She received a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in psychology from the University of Guelph and a doctorate in psychology from the University of Western Ontario. She completed postdoctoral fellowships at McMaster University and Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mueller.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss a study we recently conducted where we looked at the potential impact of certain vehicle technologies that may help to address the disproportionate crash risk that teenage drivers face. And while many crash avoidance features benefit the general population, several vehicle technologies address crash scenarios for which teen drivers are particularly at risk. Teen drivers have a higher risk for distraction, poor hazard detection and recognition, poor vehicle control, risk-taking behavior, and that includes speeding and not wearing a seatbelt, as well as nighttime driving. And in fact, their fatal crash risk is 4 times higher at night than during the day. Next slide, please. Now, the vehicle environment is changing, and some automakers and smartphone app companies offer technologies that are specifically designed for teens. Teen-specific technology suites offered by manufacturers such as Ford's MyKey system or GM's Teen Driver require parents to program one of their key fobs to be recognized by the vehicle as the teen's key fob. Once the vehicle recognizes the teen's key fob, it activates a suite of technologies designed to address the risky behavior that is typical for teen drivers. And it places restrictions around those behaviors, such as speed limiters to prevent speeding and seatbelt interlocks to prevent seatbelt noncompliance. Some automakers also make it so that certain crash avoidance features cannot be disabled, as they've been shown to mitigate and reduce crashes among the general public. In this study, the vehicle technologies that we specifically looked into included 3 types of crash avoidance features: forward collision avoidance, lane departure prevention, and blind spot detection. But we also looked at 3 types of smartphone app and vehicle technologies that have been designed specifically for teen drivers: speed limiters, extended seatbelt reminders and interlocks, as well as curfew violation notifications. Speed limiters are typically set by the teen's parents, and monitoring apps are used by parents to enforce curfew restrictions. Next slide, please. Now, the goal of this study was to understand how many crashes occur every year involving teen drivers that are relevant to these 6 technologies. The purpose of the analysis was to provide a maximum potential estimate for the impact of these technologies for teen drivers specifically. Now, the reason why we did this study was because teen drivers represent a high-risk group that needs more convincing to drive vehicles with these features than the rest of the driving population. So to calculate these estimates, we examined US police-reported crash data from 2016 to 2019 involving passenger vehicle drivers aged 16 to 19 years. For each type of crash scenario relevant to one of these 6 technologies, the crash outcomes were separated into the number of crashes involving teen drivers, the number of injured teen drivers, and the number of teen drivers killed. Next slide, please. And before I discuss these findings here, I want to point out that crashes are complex and often have multiple contributing factors. And this means that more than one of these 6 technologies could be relevant to a crash. Now, our results show that teen driver-specific features have the largest potential for reducing teen driver injuries and especially fatalities. Crash avoidance features altogether could be relevant to approximately 1/4 of injured teens and 1/3 of teen driver deaths. When all of these technologies are considered together, these technologies have the potential to prevent up to 78 of teen driver fatalities, 47% of injured teen drivers, and 41% of crashes involving teen drivers. Next slide, please. But there are a few caveats when it comes to interpreting these findings, though. First of all, it's worth noting that maximum potential estimates presented here make certain assumptions that are unlikely to be completely fulfilled in the real world. First of all, in order to calculate the percentage of crashes that have scenarios relevant to these technologies, maximum potential estimates assume, first and foremost, that everyone uses these technologies. Secondly, that everyone is always in 100% compliance with these technologies, especially, for example, the ones that rely on parental involvement to enforce restrictions. And thirdly, that these technologies work perfectly, when in fact, in the real world, we know that that's impossible. We lack the exposure data to allow us to calculate the actual effect estimates for teen drivers specifically for all of these technologies. But if we take the effect estimates that have been calculated for crash avoidance features among the general population, we can conclude that these technologies will still have considerable impact for teen driver safety. Specifically, we know that AEB reduces rear-end crashes by 50% among the general public, and therefore approximately 110,000 relevant crashes among teen drivers could be prevented. Likewise, we also know that lane departure prevention and blind spot detection reduce relevant crashes by 11 to 14% respectively. So that means that approximately 6,500 and 4,500 relevant crashes could be prevented for teen drivers. Now, an important thing to note here is that this study does not represent an exhaustive list of all relevant technologies for teens. For example, cell phone blockers have been shown to effectively reduce teen driver phone conversations and texting. But unfortunately, driver cell phone use at the time of a crash is very difficult to reliably extract from crash data, thereby limiting our ability to calculate the maximum potential safety benefits of such technologies. And this is why we could not include it in this analysis. Next slide, please. Now, there are significant barriers to these technologies in terms of their being able to achieve their desired effects. First and foremost, these features must be used in order to have an effect. But unfortunately, teen drivers tend to drive older vehicles that do not have the latest crash worthiness and crash avoidance features. Now, parental attitudes about the technology will also influence the likelihood that those features will be used by teens. And parental willingness to implement and activate certain technologies, such as speed limiters, and enforce restrictions, such as curfew, will likewise affect the ability of these technologies to have an effect. Also, despite the technical sophistication of vehicles today, these technologies are not perfect. For example, crash avoidance features will struggle to perform optimally in inclement weather. Also, these technologies are designed to address very specific crash scenarios. And as I mentioned before, in the real world, crash events often are complex and have many contributing factors. And while these technologies have been shown to have a net overall benefit, none of them can be treated as silver bullets guaranteed to prevent all crashes. Finally, there is little naturalistic observation data on teen drivers in terms of how they learn to drive with these technologies. And therefore, it's unknown whether any of these technologies have unintended consequences in terms of how teens use them. Next slide, please. So in summary, here are the take-home points. First and foremost, we've shown that vehicle and smartphone technologies can improve teen driver safety, but GDL restrictions and traffic law compliance remains important. Both teens and their parents need to understand the value of these technologies in order for them to adopt and accept them. And while it's unclear whether these technologies might have unintended consequences among these young drivers, insurance claim data are already showing benefits for young drivers. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller, for describing your powerful research on the benefits of collision avoidance technology and reducing traffic crashes among teens. Next, I would like to introduce Paul Scaglione, Director of Safety at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Paul Scaglione joined Auto Innovators as the Director of Safety, having previously worked at the Association of Global Automakers for almost 9 years. Paul has worked extensively on a number of safety and advanced technology policy issues, including automated and connected vehicles, advanced driver assistance systems, federal motor vehicle safety standards, vehicle consumer information programs, and cybersecurity. Paul has a master's degree in transportation policy, Operations and Logistics from George Mason University, and a bachelor's degree in computer science. Paul, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking the NTSB and Member Graham for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in today's panel discussion on this important topic. And as Member Graham mentioned, my name is Paul Scaglione, Director of Safety at the Alliance of Automotive Innovation, or Auto Innovators, as we're more commonly known. Next slide. So Auto Innovators is an association that represents manufacturers of nearly 99% of new cars and light trucks sold in the US, as well as original equipment suppliers and other technology companies and trade associations. So our members are really on the leading edge of developing advanced vehicle technologies and services. Our collective vision is really to transform personal mobility for cleaner, safer, and smarter future. Next slide. So before doing a deeper dive on the technologies that can help improve teen driver safety, it's important first to look at the safety challenges that we're facing on our roadways. And in recent years, unfortunately, we've seen a reversing trend in terms of motor vehicle fatalities on our roadway. Recently, and we found out in 2020, more than 38,000 people died in motor vehicle crashes, which is a 6.8% increase over 2019. And this was despite seeing positive reduction in overall injuries. But when looking at fatalities involving young drivers between 15 and 20 years old, we saw a disproportionate increase of around 14% during that same time period, which really reversed a lot of the progress that we'd seen made between 2010 and 2019, where there's actually a 14% reduction. So there is opportunity, I think, to move forward and see positive impact. And Alexandra mentioned in the presentation before a number of the factors driving these numbers, both for teen drivers as well as the general population. But speed, impairment, restraint use, and distraction are all key issues that need to be addressed, and really looking collectively how we can address these challenges as a society and reduce the number of injuries and fatalities, both in the short term and the long term. Next slide. So Auto Innovators is supportive of the NTSB and the broader administration's focus on the safe systems approach, as it provides a great frame of reference for really ensuring a holistic approach to safety. So the remainder of my presentation is really going to focus on three core aspects of the safe system. That's safe road users, safe speeds, and safe vehicles. Next slide. So from a safe road user perspective, obviously driver licensing and skills testing are foundational. But as Member Graham mentioned at the beginning, how to safely build experience and knowledge of the roadway environment really sort of defines how a safe driver understands the risks, understands traffic movement, and just general ways for increasing overall level of safety. So maintaining those safe speeds, using our restraints, don't drive impaired, and avoid devices or other distractions that may take your mind and eyes off the roadway. As a father of two future teen drivers, it's never really too early to start the conversation, at least in my own experience. Just they watch a lot and they ask a lot of questions, and they're really interested in technology. So it's really helpful to start early of talking about what it means to be a safe driver and lead by example. And there's a large number of resources to help support this conversation. And I wanted to highlight that several manufacturers have developed programs to help further develop skills, both practical as well as online materials, addressing a number of core aspects, including defensive driving, for example. Next slide. And in addition to safe driving behaviors, how do consumers think about safety when it comes to what car the teen driver may operate? Obviously, there are important equity and accessibility issues that come into play, so it may not be possible in all cases to purchase a new vehicle for a teen driver. But we're seeing with continued advancements in vehicle safety and overall performance of the fleet, increasing number of options are becoming available also in the used car market, including with respect to crash avoidance technology. And there are a number of extensive resources to help consumers make an informed decision about what features and functionality to really look for that best suits their needs. These include the NHTSA New Car Assessment Program, which rates vehicle performance and is currently looking to make updates to the program. IHS, as well as JD Power and Consumer Reports, also provide great information as well. And specifically, the key issues to look for is sort of crash worthiness, performance, how it performs in various crash tests. But increasingly, and as I'll talk about in a few moments, what are some of the crash avoidance technologies that can really help avoid and reduce the severity of crashes occurring, as well as some of the other technologies that Alexandra spoke about just a few moments ago. Next slide. So just a quick overview of some of the technologies that are already available and out there. There's forward collision technologies that utilize camera-based and radar systems to basically alert the driver of a slowing or stopped vehicle in the road ahead, or provide intervention when they may not apply the appropriate amount of force or don't recognize the hazard in the roadway ahead. And we're getting closer to seeing this as standard technology across a substantial number of new vehicles following the voluntary industry commitment that was signed in 2016. Many of these forward collision technologies also incorporate pedestrian automatic emergency braking, which perform a similar function, but are designed to detect the presence of a pedestrian in the roadway under certain conditions. Camera systems can also help support lane keeping, providing a warning or intervention if the vehicle is found to be moving from its lane. An additional sensor technology can help detect vehicles in the blind spots, either providing a warning or intervention. And advanced lighting, which is important for teens who may be driving in at night, where you have adaptive driving beams or headlights that respond to curves in the road. And we're seeing demonstrated effectiveness in a number of studies. So we're seeing those benefits hopefully translating down for teen drivers as well. Next slide. And beyond those active crash avoidance systems, there are a number of other technologies that can really help support and reinforce safe driving habits. And several manufacturers have introduced these technologies to allow parents to, in some cases, adjust the settings for certain crash avoidance features or require additional safety checks prior to a trip. For example, a seatbelt assurance system that may limit the ability of the vehicle to drive until seatbelts are fastened, setting limits on the speed that the vehicle can be driven. We're seeing with more automated systems, driver monitoring systems being introduced to use facial detection to identify when a person may be looking away from the roadway or may require additional attention. Also, with regard to HMI integration or human machine interface, and basically how a user's phone may be paired to provide limited functionality during the driving task, so that folks would maybe have access to music or other media that allows them to continue to focus on the driving task without having to use their device. Other features include audio limit also to avoid sort of obscuring external sounds. And as Alexandra mentioned, there's also technology to receive insights on how a vehicle is being driven by a teen driver, and really provides the opportunity to provide feedback and coaching and really have that constructive conversation with teen drivers to identify areas for improvement. But obviously consumer acceptance is an important factor to consider for each of these. Next slide. And as we move forward, particularly with new technology, it's really going to be important that consumers are aware of sort of the features and functionality that are on their vehicle and develop that understanding. And there are many opportunities as to how this could be improved over time. Some of the examples I've listed here is looking at updated driver licensing and skills testing. So integration of technology as part of the process, and really developing that baseline and common understanding of how technology operates, as opposed to requiring to learn it at the dealership, for example. They'll already have that baseline level of awareness. And then integrating new resources for educating drivers as part of the process. So at the moment, there's a number of ongoing efforts to clear the confusion and provide those resources that really explain in detail how systems function. And then as we get to higher levels of automation, really understanding and reinforcing the role of the driver with respect to crash avoidance systems, as well as higher levels of automation and how those can be integrated. And then I think exploring new methods for connecting with teen drivers. So not just developing the necessary materials, but how to sort of connect and make sure that the message gets across. And we're encouraged by NTSB's partnering with various influencers and looking at other means for engaging with consumers and providing that continuous reinforcement and really defining the overall safety culture. Next slide. So in conclusion, I think the three areas that I wanted to just reemphasize is on safe vehicles. So it's important to consider vehicle safety for teen drivers and looking at increased levels of safety in the vehicle fleet, as well as what technologies may best suit each particular family's needs. Safe road users, really using all available tools and education materials to reinforce safe driving behavior. And then safe speeds, obviously targeting those the teen drivers who may be most at risk, particularly young males who seem to be showing a higher propensity towards high-speed collisions. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you again for the invitation to speak today.
Thank you, Paul. Automakers play a critical role in the safety of our young drivers. Safe vehicles are critical to a safe future for our teen drivers. Now I'd like to get to the national perspective on driver's education with a presentation from William Van Tassel. William Van Tassel is the manager of driver training operations for AAA National Office. He is responsible for developing, implementing, and evaluating AAA's driver education and training programs. Additionally, Dr. Van Tassel served as president of the American Driver and Traffic Safety Education Association from 2019 to 2021, and was three-time chair of the Association of National Stakeholders in Traffic Safety Education, the entity responsible for advancing the NHTSA-funded National Drivers Education Standards. Over to you, Dr. Van Tassel.
Thank you, Member Graham, and it's great to be invited to participate in this event. Teens and technology, well, usually it's a pretty good match. It permeates their lives and they embrace it. But letting them figure out how to use collision avoidance technologies on their own, out on the road, maybe not. So here's where I see that driver education can play an effective role here. I'll be sharing some comments related to the possible roles of driver educations, helping prepare teams to use these technologies safely and effectively, particularly regarding advantages, challenges, and opportunities. So we'll jump right into advantages. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to start with, driver education is a large existing infrastructure. In terms of scope, we've got thousands of driving schools training hundreds of thousands of new drivers every year, both in the classroom and behind the wheel. And it's growing. As states start to allow more delivery channels for driver education and work to increase equal access, we've got more students taking some form of driver education. Second, we're reaching teens at the very start of their driving careers. Driver education can help form those habits for a lifetime. We just have to make sure that those are good habits. And third, in terms of advantages, NHTSA's solid support. With encouragement from the NTSB, NHTSA has been very engaged in driver education for over a decade now. And an early step on NHTSA's part was to bring together a group of subject matter experts to create the first ever national driver education standards. And that success led to the establishment of a national stakeholder panel to maintain and update the standards with ongoing support from NHTSA. Now, this group identified an issue around technology a bit ago, knowing that instructors were well behind in their knowledge of vehicle technologies, driving instructors. So the stakeholder panel proposed creating a training regimen to help get those instructors up to speed. NHTSA agreed and supported the project, and now we have the ADAS instructor lesson plans, a 4.5-hour course of study for new and experienced instructors. Pilot testing is done and delivery is ongoing right now. So basically, driver education would not be where it is and where it's going were it not for NHTSA support for the past decade. Next slide, please, as we move into some challenges. When it comes to states, their curriculum content standards, particularly for vehicle technology, are generally way behind. So states usually set the standards for the content topics that must be covered in driver education in that state. And generally, states have not kept those standards current, particularly in vehicle technology. So, for example, there's a state in the Midwest does a lot of instructor training, but their own state requirements for content in terms of vehicle technology, all we see there is anti-lock brakes and electronic stability control. Now, that's great if it's 1990, but they're, again, a bit behind. There's another state in the Northwest, a really strong driver ed program, but actually in their state standards, they don't list a single vehicle technology that must be covered in driver education. So you can complete driver education in that course in that state and never learn anything about vehicle technology. So basically, curriculum providers, and I would put AAA in that bucket as well, who want to offer a modern program need to turn, therefore, to other national standards, such as the National Driver Education Standards, which are always kept current in terms of topics to cover. And that's what we did at AAA with our revised How to Drive driver education curriculum. We even added an entire new chapter on vehicle technology. Second, we run into some challenges sometimes with how manufacturers portray their technologies in their TV ads and their promotions. And they look pretty solid. They look close to 100% effective on TV, but we know through testing that they're not there yet. In some cases, they have a long way to go in certain environments, such as automatic emergency braking in nighttime situations, just not very effective yet. They're going to get there, but it's not quite there yet. So to some degree, when a student walks into a driver education program, not only do we need to teach them everything they need to know, but we also sometimes have to overcome some of those expectations that they bring with them, if you will. Also, teens tend to be at greater risk of over-relying on vehicle technologies. They might be too comfortable, too trusting, and that can be very dangerous. That behavioral adaptation is a big risk, and teens may even be more susceptible to it. We're all susceptible to it. We're human, but perhaps that's an even bigger problem for teens. Also, collision avoidance technologies are advancing and evolving rapidly. So to stay current, curriculum providers really need to update their programs more frequently than before. For example, in covering lane keeping assistance, now we're also needing to cover lane centering. For some people, the distinction between those two technologies might be very important. Now, at the driving school level, timing can also be a challenge. We still only have about 30 hours of classroom and about 6 hours of actual behind the wheel training, where the teen is actually behind the wheel. So now we also have to cover a fair bit of vehicle technology. And that means some of the other topics we either cover less or somehow get a little bit more efficient in covering everything that teens need to know. Also, training vehicles at the driving school level can be a challenge because they tend not to be able to purchase the newest, most expensive vehicles with the most technologies. It's not unusual to see a driver ed training vehicle that's 10 or even 15 years old. Yes, they may have some basic systems, a backup camera, blind spot monitoring, but perhaps not much more than that. But we also know that vehicles used for practice driving in the family, parents and guardians, during driver education, those vehicles may have quite a bit more technology. And speaking of parents and guardians, they are generally responsible for conducting 30, 40, 50, 60 hours or more of practice driving as part of state's graduated driver licensing process. And as their teens coach in that situation, those parents and guardians might have misconceptions about vehicle technology and may even try to override an instructor's training. I heard a story just yesterday that a young lady got back into the driver education vehicle and went out for the next driving session. And the instructor asked the young lady to make a lane change, which she did, but she did not turn her head and do a head check, which we do teach. And the instructor said, well, we've done that before, but this time you didn't do that. Why is that? She said, oh, well, my mom said as long as the light in the side mirror wasn't lit up, that I could just go ahead and change lanes. So parents can actually bring on some challenges as well. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, opportunities. So opportunities to start with states. First, update the curriculum standards and content standards, keep those current. And if you don't want to do that, if you don't want that effort to go to that effort every single year, just adopt the National Driver Education Curriculum Content Standards. Get out from under that commitment. And it's only going to get worse as vehicle technologies advance further and further. For curriculum providers, we need to be updating those curriculums more frequently. In past years, a curriculum might be frozen for 4, 6, 8 years. Well, technology in vehicles is moving much too fast. So I know AAA ourselves, we released our revised curriculum in 2000, and we're already having to update it this year, largely because we want to make sure we have the latest on vehicle technology in there. And then for driving schools, a great first step is to use a curriculum that contains comprehensive and accurate content on vehicle technology. Even if a state doesn't require it, they should be using a curriculum that meets the national standards for content. Second, driving schools can explore obtaining newer vehicles for training vehicles, some with more technologies. There are some ways to do that, perhaps partner with local dealerships or rent car organizations. Some driving schools are very successful in doing that. Third, maybe explore utilizing new teaching technologies such as virtual reality. Having students sort of experience using collision avoidance technologies before they actually get behind the wheel of a car could be very effective and very efficient. Also, I want to couch the appeal for safe and effective use, how the driving schools communicate the message to new drivers. It might be even more effective, instead of using a safety appeal, to maybe use an appeal toward helping save fuel and reduce their vehicles and negative effects on the environment. So that do it for safety message doesn't tend to maybe resonate as strongly with teens as do it to save money and the environment. That might be a bit better approach. So next slide. And in summary, we know from research from the organizations in the meeting today that teens can benefit greatly from collision avoidance technologies, but only if they use them safely and effectively. And this is one area where driver education can offer additional value to help teens develop those good habits for a lifetime, to move them away from consuming technology for a performance benefit, like driving faster, paying less attention, and toward the habit of consuming them for a safety benefit. Maybe even to the point where we're getting them in the mindset to drive as if their vehicles did not have these technologies and allow them to back them up if needed. Helping them start to live the mantras of know thy vehicle, always stay ahead of your technology, and help them understand that they are still in charge. They are the most effective system in the vehicle, and they can't blame the technology if something goes wrong. And the last step in the future will be to describe, I think, how driver education integrates with the safe system approach. Most of you are aware of this system, which is sweeping through the US after a great deal of success in Europe. And while there are 5 components in this model, the potential connection between the safe road users and safe vehicles is perhaps particularly strong, or at least it should be and can be. As a clear part of the safe road users component, driver education can be viewed as helping to prepare drivers to maximize those potential benefits of the safe vehicles. But as well, this viewpoint could also be sort of bidirectional. As safe vehicles evolve, that needs to inform driver education to help train safe road users. We'll all likely see more about the safe system approach, and it's clear that collision avoidance technologies will play a key role in its successful implementation throughout the US. So that's a quick run through of some of the advantages and challenges and opportunities related to driver education's potential roles in helping new drivers use these technologies safely and effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Tassel, for providing a fantastic overview of the driver's education on a national and state level. I would now like to introduce Nadine Anderson. Dr. Anderson is Director of Federal Affairs at INRIX, the global leader in connected car services and intelligent movement. She has spent the majority of her career working on public policy issues related to the intersection of transportation and technology, and specializes in the subjects of road and traffic safety and transportation equity. Her professional experience spans all levels of government, both domestic and international, and her resume includes major corporations like Uber, AAA, and most recently, Cruise, General Motors' majority-owned full electric self-driving car company. Dr. Anderson.
So, hi everyone. Before getting started, I too would like to thank the National Transportation Safety Board and Member Graham for the opportunity to be here today and join this conversation. As mentioned, my name is Nadine Anderson, and I look after federal affairs at INRIX. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with INRIX, we are the global leader in data, insights, and analytics, and our work is centered around our mission, which is to help shape the future of mobility by providing resources and tools that can help people identify and solve transportation issues and to make data-driven decisions. And I'm here today in two capacities. First is as someone who's been working in the fields of transportation, technology, and road and traffic safety for more than a decade. And secondly, as a qualitative researcher and public policy professional. Now, my contribution to today's conversation is to add an additional layer to our discussion, which is the lens of equity. However, before getting to this, I'm going to set the stage by reminding you of some facts and stats, and then add on some trends that are currently present when it comes to advanced vehicle technology and early adoption. And if I do my job, by the end of my remarks, you too will see that we're at an inflection point. One where if we don't shift how we think and how we act, we risk not only failing to reach our shared goal of zero deaths, but we'll also do so in a manner that has disparate impacts. Next slide, please. So as a nation, we are laser focused on the goal of zero road deaths. The US Department of Transportation released its first ever national roadway safety strategy. And we're also in the process of implementing a once in a generational infrastructure bill with significant funds for road and traffic safety. Now, arguably, for the first time, we not only have the intent, but also the resources to make real change happen. We know that addressing what's happening on our nation's roadways will take every tool that we have available to us. So as we continue to have this conversation about teens and technology, I want to highlight 2 points that I would like you to keep in mind. Now, these points I'm raising not because I'm implying a relationship, but I'm flagging them because they exist in the same universe as our topic, and they are informative for our discussion and what's likely ahead. Now, we see on the left, and it was also raised by former prior panelists, that traffic crashes are a leading cause of death for teens, and that there are also signals that collision avoidance technologies and other systems can help. And we also know and begin to look deeper into what the data is telling us about who is impacted. We are seeing that certain people, certain groups, and populations are being disproportionately reflected in the data. For example, if you cut the data to examine risk by race and ethnicity, you'll find higher death rates for American Indian, Alaska Natives, and for Black people. If you look at geographic locations, you'll see that Black, American Indian, and people who live in rural communities are disproportionately reflected in the statistics. Between 2019 and 2020, roadway fatalities amongst Black people increased by 23% compared to an overall increase of 7.2%. And finally, when you look at demographics, you see that socioeconomic status can also influence the risk of motor vehicle crash involvement. So I won't belabor the point, you get it, but one can start to see and understand that something is happening here. And in my view, it is reasonable to think that our current method of operating, specifically our approach, our policies, and our programs are starting to yield some disparate impacts. Next slide. And here's where technology enters into the conversation. So technology is often framed as the great neutralizer because it can operate in a manner that overcomes some of those systemic barriers, and they can have a positive benefit for the populations that we want to target. For today's conversation, that specifically means teens. And I personally believe that this is true. However, it doesn't seem to happen by chance. And if we look at the trends when it comes to advanced vehicle technologies or other innovative transportation or mobility options, what we see is that the availability does not equal access or impact. And this is how equity enters into the conversation. So before I get into how all these things are connected, I want to take a moment to define the word that I'm about to start using more frequently, which is equity. Now, equity is often mistaken for equality or accessibility. And while these terms are all related, it is important to know that they are not synonyms. Essentially, when you are doing work with a focus on, or through the lens of equity, you should be open to not only giving people what is needed for the same outcomes, but you should also work to eliminate barriers and maybe revise how your systems currently function. And on this slide, you'll see that there are folks who have been working in this space for quite some time. Equity, especially as it relates to transportation, is a discipline, and there are many experts that are out there. A couple of organizations that are at the forefront are again shown on these slides, and please keep in mind that there are more. And all these groups are working to make sure that everyone can benefit from advanced vehicle technologies and new mobility solutions. Now, you'll also see on this slide a couple of trends that I want to call out. Because like many things, when it comes to technology, the past is prologue. I think electric vehicle and rideshare are good examples because they're connected to in-vehicle technologies and collision avoidance systems and other technologies that were mentioned earlier. And they also speak to how people are willing to both make different purchase decisions and engage with these new technologies when they're in the vehicle. Now, we've seen how both of these technologies have played out. And so there's no reason to think that these trends won't repeat themselves as we look at teens and overall looking at teens through the lens of equity. Next slide, please. So here's the takeaway. If we don't change course, we actually limit the promise of technology, not only overall, but specifically as it relates to teens and other groups who are being disproportionately reflected in the data. Now, I am absolutely a believer in the value of collision avoidance systems and features that can help people see and respond to what's happening on the road. But when you look at the data and the associated trends, it's clear that what we're currently doing, which we can refer to as our business as usual case, is leaving a gap and we're missing a piece of our population. Now, you may be wondering how I can be so certain the same may play out when it comes to teens. So to explain a little bit more about my why, I'm going to walk us through a bit of a thought exercise together. Well, this is one that is rooted in, trickle-down effector theory, or a concept or logic model that I think many people are familiar with, and something that was also alluded to in prior presentations. Now, I will say that there are, of course, exceptions to this, but let's say that the majority of teens and novice drivers are likely to lean on and or use cars that are available to them. So if you put collision avoidance systems or other advanced vehicle technologies in the hands of their guardians or people in their social circles, they're also likely to benefit. However, what we know is today that many of these features are still making their way into the overall vehicle fleet, and that there are new cars or higher end cars and are vehicles that are not generally available. It was also shared earlier that teens are more likely to use older cars. And when you look at who is purchasing new cars, and I will admit here that the data is a bit tricky for a number of reasons, and this could be a whole other webinar, what you see is that the vast majority of people in the US identify as white, and then followed by Hispanic or Latino and Black when it comes to purchasing new cars. Now, combine this with the data about teen drivers and which groups are disproportionately reflected in the stats, and you'll begin to see why equity is an important piece of the conversation. So simply stated, if there's a big gap in who has the vehicles with the latest and greatest, one can easily think about who is likely to benefit from these life-saving technologies and who is not. Next slide, please. So now that we're all grounded in a degree of what's happening in the decision point that we face, I also want to say that we are not powerless here. There is a formula that we've been following, and if we add some new variables and make some adjustments, we can change outcomes. And since no one likes to have a problem identified without a solution being proposed, I want to start to wrap up my presentation with 2 suggestions. Now, the first is that we continue to build out the body of knowledge on transportation and safety through a lens that allows us to get at equity. We know that what's measured gets addressed, and that there are orgs and entities that are working to understand vehicle owners' experience with things like ADAS, collision avoidance systems, and other in-vehicle technologies. And I'm showing a few of my favorites on this slide. However, I do want to say, and to be perfectly honest, there aren't a lot of studies out there that look at disparate impacts or break down the data or findings by race or ethnicity. Additionally, it's also quite challenging to find studies that look at teens or populations overall who are Black, Latino, or Native American, and their respective understandings and acceptance of collision avoidance technologies and other solutions. Now, this is by no means a critique of existing research. I raise it here to show that there is a gap, and this is what we do as policy and research professionals. We see gaps and then we work to fill them. So this is one thing that I think we should do. We should increase the body of knowledge when it comes to teens, transportation equity, and safety. Next slide. So in addition to focusing on the data, I also suggest that we do what's on this slide. And a couple of these facets were also implied by other panelists. So we move beyond incentives and focus more on engagement and communication. Now, I added a quote to the slide from one of my peers, Dr. Shelley Francis, who is at EV Noir, because it sums up what you can expect when you start to operate differently and work to engage different populations and communities, especially those who have experienced disparate impacts and or who have been left out of the equation overall. And I'm putting it here to show that even with the data, things will take time to change, which is why we need to start acting differently now. So our success when it comes to closing this gap and our ability to get to zero and address teen safety will move at the speed of the trust that we can build with the people and the populations who we want to positively impact. So what does this mean in practice? So I suggest moving beyond only relying on monetary incentives and instead design comprehensive programs to increase adoption and acceptance. Now, when it comes to teens, this is complicated because there are two audiences that you have to engage. You have to engage the teen driver, and you also have to engage the guardian, and they make and are incentivized and moved by different things. Now, the text on this slide is a summary of some of the things that I think that we should keep in mind. These recommendations are based on what we've learned about the adoption and acceptance of technology, regardless of age, but it takes an equity-focused approach. So first, we know that a person's exposure and level of understanding influences how they use and interact with technology. So when it comes to teens, we need to make sure that everyone is getting exposed to the technology, not just those who come from certain socioeconomic backgrounds or live in certain areas. And we also need to look at penetration. We need to understand where the cars are with these life-saving technologies being sold, and how can we remove any other barriers that may exist to adoption. Now, next, we also know that you engage by listening first and acting second. This means working to understand the diversity within the group of teens. Teens who live in urban settings will have different experiences with technologies than their peers who may live in rural settings. Black and Latino teens may also have different experiences and needs than their white counterparts, and we need to be able to engage and work with all groups. So again, listen first and then act second. Now, lastly, I wanted to call out the importance of focusing on targeted messaging and metrics. So in addition to increasing exposure and engagement, we need to figure out ways to speak directly to the populations we want to reach, and also to measure whether what we're doing is working. We also need to be flexible when it comes to this. Again, different audiences will require different ways of being engaged and reached, and there's no use of putting out a message that doesn't resonate, or one that people can't hear or understand, or one that doesn't yield the desired outcome. Next slide, please. So I want to close again by highlighting the fact that we are at an inflection point, and that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do things differently and make things better for all people. Now, I am fully confident that technology can help save lives and reduce the number of crashes we see on our roads, especially when it comes to teens and novice drivers. However, I do maintain that we need to shift how we think and make sure we're leveraging technology in new and different ways and in a manner that allows everyone to benefit. Business as usual means the benefits of technology only reaches certain populations and certain segments of those subpopulations. And operating in this way means only certain teens are positioned to benefit from these technologies, like collision-avoidance systems. Now, we are in the midst of a perfect storm and uniquely suited to change course and move in a manner that is equitable. So the challenge that I'm posing to all of us out here, myself included, is to let's do better and make sure that we all get to our goal of Vision Zero. And with that, I would like to thank you for the time today and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Equity is an important conversation that must be considered when we discuss these new technologies. As I mentioned previously, the NTSB has been advocating for collision avoidance technology systems for over 25 years, and we continue to advocate to this day. I would like to close our presentations today with a presentation on the NTSB's perspective on collision avoidance systems. Our final presenter is the NTSB's Director of Highway Safety, Rob Malloy. Dr. Malloy has been with the NTSB for over 25 years. He currently serves as the director with the NTSB's Office of Highway Safety. In this role, he is responsible for overseeing crash investigations and the development of crash and safety reports. Prior to joining the Office of Highway Safety, Dr. Malloy designed and carried out safety studies in the Office of Research and Engineering. His PhD is in applied experimental psychology, which he earned at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Malloy?
Member Graham, thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm filling in for Dr. Raphael Marshall, who's currently launching on a crash investigation. For my presentation, I'd like to focus on the board's history of promoting and investigating collision avoidance systems in all vehicles. Next slide. So when I refer to CAS, I mean a suite of technologies that include a collision warning system that alerts a driver of an impending collision, dynamic brake support, which primes the brakes and can increase braking force if a driver is not applying brakes hard enough, and automatic emergency braking, which applies brakes automatically to mitigate or even avoid a crash. Next slide. So why has the NTSB and other safety organizations been so insistent on vehicles equipped with CAS? Well, as we've heard earlier, they're effective. In 2020, IHS analyzed police-reported crashes and insurance claims and found that rear-end crashes are cut by an astounding 50% and rear-end crashes with injuries by 56% when a vehicle is equipped with CAS. So if everyone had CAS in 2019, that would have meant 1.1 million fewer crashes and 330,000 fewer injuries. Given the disproportionate number of teens that die and are injured on the roadway each year, especially from distracted and impaired driving, one can quickly see the benefits of this technology in all vehicles. Next slide. The NTSB was an early proponent of crash avoidance technologies. Back in 1995, we investigated a multi-vehicle fog-related crash in Menifee, Arkansas. As a result of that investigation, we recommended that the DOT sponsor fleet testing of forward collision warning systems in heavy vehicles. Next slide. In 2001, after investigating 9 rear-end crashes that killed 20 and injured 181, we recommended that the US DOT develop performance standards for forward collision warning systems in all vehicles. Next slide. In 2008, after investigating a crash where a tractor semi-trailer collided with an overturned motor coach, we recommended that NHTSA study the effectiveness of CAS in heavy vehicles and require them if found effective. Next slide. And in 2015, we published a follow-up special investigation where we recommended that NHTSA require CAS on all new vehicles. We also made a companion recommendation that urged vehicle manufacturers to include CAS as standard equipment in all vehicles. Next slide. As of now, CAS is still not required in vehicles sold in the US. What NHTSA has done is to create minimum performance standard for AEB that manufacturers should meet. These standards are based on an AEB-equipped vehicle's ability to avoid stopping, slowing, or decelerating a lead vehicle. And the maximum speed differential in these tests is 25 miles an hour. Vehicles with AEB meet the minimum performance specifications that are listed in the recommended safety technology on NHTSA's new car assessment program. In addition, in 2016, NHTSA and 20 of the largest automakers agreed to make low-speed AEB a standard feature on 99% of all new cars by September 1st, 2022. The industry appears to be on track to have at least 90% of new vehicles equipped with AEB this year. This is very good news, but is it enough? Next slide. Based on our crash investigations, there's still a lot of work to be done. We've investigated several crashes involving vehicles equipped with CAS where the technology did not activate for various reasons. In Mountain View, California, after autopilot mistook a large gore as a lane, the CAS failed to activate because it did not detect the crash attenuator at the end of the gore. Next slide. In Delray, Florida, the CAS did not activate because it didn't recognize that a tractor trailer was crossing in an intersection and was in the vehicle's line of travel. Next slide. In Culver City, California, CAS was too late to detect a fire truck blocking the lane, alerting the driver only a half second before the collision, and the AEB didn't have time to activate. Next slide. And if I may throw in a commercial vehicle crash as well, in Mount Pleasant, 3 of the vehicles were equipped with collision avoidance systems, but none activated. one due to a misalignment in its sensors, one because it didn't identify the object in front of it, and one because the approach speed was too fast. Next slide. So as wonderful technology as collision avoidance systems are, they're not foolproof. In the cases I just mentioned, we had instances where the collision avoidance system did not recognize highway objects like attenuators, did not recognize lead vehicles that were askew, did not activate in speed differentials that were high. We feel that much can still be done by regulatory agencies such as NHTSA to improve the technology, and we've made recommendations to that effect. Next slide. For example, we recommended that NHTSA expand NCAP to include ratings of collision avoidance systems as part of their 5-star system. This would encourage manufacturers to compete in terms of CAS effectiveness. We'd also like to see NHTSA expand its testing of protocols for CAS to include velocity differentials greater than 45 miles an hour. NHTSA also needs to include a variety of targets other than just the rear of vehicles, such as pedestrians, bicyclists, cross-traffic vehicle profiles, and traffic safety hardware. Europe and countries like Australia, China, Japan, and Korea are way ahead of us, and it's time that we catch up. And finally, we all need to educate our drivers to the massive benefits of CAS, but also make them aware that the system is not foolproof. This is a message that's not only drivers should hear, but also pedestrians. I think we've seen pedestrians crossing urban streets while completely engrossed in their phone. Safety is the responsibility of everyone. Next slide. So in summary, CAS-equipped vehicles are already saving thousands of road users from injury and death. We expect that CAS will be available on a large majority of passenger vehicles by the end of the year. As with its continued leadership and some prodding by all of us, NHTSA can help make CAS even more effective than it is now. Next slide. Thank you very much, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Malloy, for outlining the NTSB's recommendations and perspectives on collision avoidance technology. I appreciate all our presenters' perspectives on collision avoidance technology and teen driver safety. The topics of collision avoidance technology and teen driver safety is multifaceted. It'll take the integration of all perspectives heard today during the conversation to successfully implement and standardize this technology and prevent teen driver crashes and fatalities. During the Q&A section of today's event, we will dive deeper into what we heard during the presentations and discuss tangible solutions to advance this technology and save teen lives. At this time, I would like to ask all panelists to turn on their cameras and microphones for the Q&A portion of our conversation. In addition to our 5 presenters, I would like to welcome Benny Malberg, Vice President of the Driving Professionals Group and President and owner of Official Driving School in Michigan, to provide a local perspective on driver's education and collision avoidance technology during our Q&A session. So it looks like I have everybody up there. Initially, I will probably direct the question towards one of our panelists, but after they answer the question, go ahead and raise your hand if you want to join in and answer the question also. The questions are for everyone, so please don't be shy. So why don't we start? I'm going to start with Dr. Mueller. And can you expand on some of the unique risk factors that predispose teens to be involved in crashes? And how do collision avoidance technologies and teen-specific driver features address those specific risk factors?
Sure. I'll focus on some of the risk factors that were identified in the study I just presented to you. Speeding. Speeding is one of the major risk factors, and specifically the risky behavior that teen drivers do that is often a contributing factor in the crashes that teen drivers have. As a result, speed limiters in particular can be very valuable. And mentioned before, the teen technology suites that parents can activate in their systems, in their personal vehicles. Of course, only vehicles that are equipped with these systems, though, such as, again, I mentioned Ford's My Key system, where essentially a key fob is one of the parent's key fobs is programmed to be recognized by the vehicle to detect when the teen driver is behind the wheel. And so the way it works is the parent programs that key fob so that it's associated with the vehicle's recognition of the teen. And as soon as it recognizes that a teen is behind the wheel, it suddenly activates a system suite of technologies that are specifically geared around the teen driver risk factors, such as speeding, distraction. So for example, you'll have audio limiters where the teen can't increase the audio volume of the infotainment system beyond a certain level. Again, seatbelt interlocks, where if the driver does not buckle, him or herself, this vehicle cannot be put into drive. So essentially it's an interlock. It sits for a certain period. It will not permit the driver to put the vehicle into drive. And that helps, again, form as a deterrent to seatbelt non-compliance, which is another problem among teen drivers with respect to risky behavior. And when it comes to seatbelts, I don't think I need to, emphasize to anyone here. Everyone knows the safety value of seatbelts with respect to mitigating injuries and death in the event of a crash. And also with, for example, the curfew monitoring apps. Some vehicles have those apps actually embedded into the system suites themselves, or the parents can have a smartphone app that they activate. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, teen drivers are particularly at risk for crashes at night. And so the curfew enforcement through these monitoring apps helps parents enforce the GDL restrictions around curfew. But the problem is with GDL restrictions, they vary from state to state. So again, having parents as an active enforcer, regardless of the GDL requirements of the state, also help to, again, prevent teens from driving under the riskier circumstances. So I hope that starts to answer your question.
Absolutely. Would anybody else like to join in?
Yeah, I think maybe just one point to add, and I think Alexandra covered a lot of the main points well. I think obviously one of the challenges is that widespread deployment of these technologies will take time. So how do we sort of augment that in the short term, and looking at those actions to address driver behavior in the short term, and sort of target specifically teens with the messages around making sure that they're restrained. I think there was almost over 40% of the fatalities were unrestrained for the 2020 report that NHTSA recently put out. So I don't think there's any sense in kind of holding off for that, but sort of continuing the messaging while the technology becomes more widespread. And as consumer demand for these technologies increases, I think if you look at the recent NCAP request for comment, NHTSA is also asking questions about how to potentially raise the profile of teen driver applications. So I think that's something that the industry is looking at also.
Thank you, Paul. Benny.
Awesome. Yeah, and I just wanted to add more about a local experience to this as well. So the the risk factors that we see in driver education too is that we have teens that are predisposed and they develop these habits around their phones, right? And when they're ringing and they're alerting teens to different things. And part of what we do in the classes and with driver education programs is we try to break those habits. And I think that as these technologies develop, what puts them at risk is those bad habits that they've already developed, and keeping in mind that you could actually tap into those, as you're developing these technologies. When the wheel shakes, right, when it vibrates for the lane position, it's triggering something in that teen's mind that, hey, I've got to draw my attention. It refocuses them. So I think, I think that a lot of the technologies that are developing around that stuff is kind of, taking into that, tapping into those habits. And, I like what William said about about how we can't be overly dependent on the technologies. And if the technologies are developed in ways that reinforce what we're teaching in driver education, that is a win-win. If we can get a student to look over their shoulder, if we can get them to look at the camera, if we can get an alert that notifies them to pay attention to something that's reinforcing some of the things that we're doing in driver education, I think those will only, they'll build on the habits that we're trying to set at a foundational level.
Excellent, thank you. Anybody else on this?
If I may, one thing I think too is young people are learning to drive. They're learning how to scan the environment to look for hazards and not necessarily optimally. And so these technologies can kind of give them that extra protection as they get better at finding what risks are coming towards them and responding to them. So I think that really helps them as they're going through that phase of what is important for me to attend to and how long can I scan at certain things.
And actually, just touching on Robert just mentioned with respect to basically intervening when the driver misses a step. We know that teen drivers will miss probably more steps than a more experienced driver. This is also where, again, crash avoidance features, which are created for the general population, can be beneficial, such as auto brake or AEB. If the driver is otherwise distracted, as Robert just said, scanning not necessarily the most effectively or efficiently, and they don't catch that they're coming into a situation where they may potentially rear end the vehicle in front of them. Again, the systems that help to intervene to help prevent or mitigate at least a crash can be beneficial. And again, when talking about teen driver specific technologies, with respect to systems that are designed to recognize teen drivers and don't allow the teen driver to disable those crash avoidance features, that is another potential area where teen drivers could be especially benefited from these teen driver specific suites.
Excellent, thank you for that. Let's stay with the technology here. And maybe Dr. Malloy, if you got a few comments here on this question, if you don't mind. What are the functional limitations of the technologies in collision avoidance systems and the potential unintended consequences such as distractions for novice drivers?
Well, I think one of the, as I mentioned in my presentation, we've seen a number of crashes that we've investigated, and there's a bias. We generally investigate crashes when systems don't work. But when we've gone to look at them, it could be cross traffic that the driver wasn't attending to, that the system never would have detected. It could be that they were driving too fast. And, these are all things that as people get to understand the technology more, they can compensate for. I think we also talked about different types of hardware on the road. These are things people crash into. It's a difficult task for auto manufacturers to identify everything, but I think those are things that we can identify and help then push the industry that way. One of the difficulties is as that technology gets better and better, I think drivers will tend to kind of invert. They used to be the primary system preventing the collision, and now they start, and we've added these secondary systems to help them, and then they start to rely on those systems as primary. That will keep me from colliding, and I'll wait until it reacts before I need to react. Or if you're a new driver too, you start to feel comfortable not attending to the driving task, and you can attend for longer and longer times because you get away with it until then you have that collision, especially when you don't understand the limitations of the technology.
Boy. Anybody else want to expand on that?
If I may, this is also another opportunity where vehicle ratings programs of these different technologies become particularly valuable to improve the system capabilities of these systems, and especially when the ratings criteria are data-driven. That is particularly valuable to ensure that these systems are supporting the driver and hopefully, again, avoiding as much as possible unintended consequences. And of course, that's where trickle-down effects with the development and implementations of higher levels of driving automation may be valuable for teen drivers as it relates to driver monitoring and driver management strategies. As these technologies become more sophisticated and as we learn more and discover and innovate ways to effectively implement them specific around teen drivers and what is known about the risk factors of teen drivers, the management and coaching strategies that these systems might be able to employ to help shape appropriate driver behavior, there is potential value there too, which really hasn't been explored to this day.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, well, let's go on to another question here. And I'm going to direct this to Paul Scaglione to at least start us. And I know we've talked about My Key already. I think Dr. Mueller talked about it briefly in her presentation. A 2018 study showed that just over half of the parents of teen drivers who own a My Key equipped Ford vehicle were aware of the technology, just half of them. And only a third of them reported using it with their teen driver. How can automakers work to overcome this information gap? And how can automakers maybe work with dealers as the customer-facing entity to better educate parents?
Thanks for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not able to comment on the specifics of the report, but I think as you mentioned, it does highlight an important issue that the industry is working to address, and that's ensuring that consumers are aware of the safety technology available on modern vehicles. This helps ensure a more informed purchasing decision, but also that they can avail of technologies that are already on their vehicles, given that they've made that investment in safety. I think as part of those efforts, it requires ongoing review, including looking at the assessment of certain materials and how consumers are accessing information. We recently did a study. I just pulled the information up here as part of one of our Auto Innovators working group efforts. And we found that consumers are leveraging many different sources of information when making a purchasing decision, whether it's a manufacturer website, looking at the vehicle sticker, or looking at sort of those established ratings programs such as IIHS and NCAP. And there are some encouraging signs coming from this in terms of positive levels of awareness among consumers, as well as demand for crash avoidance features. And just looking at the survey here, we found that 2/3 of the survey respondents that we'd polled have crash avoidance technology in their current vehicle, and a strong majority of them, around 86%, agree that it was important that their next vehicle be equipped with the technology, and most believe that the safety ratings were going to be important, almost 19 out of 20 respondents. So I think the awareness is growing. Over time, it will take time, and sort of how to effectively target that messaging towards different groups to make sure that it's getting across, and using really a multimedia approach, not just necessarily sticking it on a website, but sort of how can you leverage social media and other mechanisms to get the word out.
Excellent. Yeah, Dr. Van Tassel.
It occurs to me that there might be even a role for insurance companies here. When I've called my insurance company to add a vehicle or change vehicles over the years, they'll usually ask me questions. Does it have this technology or this feature or a tracking system like that? So maybe the companies could ask, does your vehicle have My Key or whatever the system is? And it might prompt the parent to go, well, gee, I'm not sure. Okay, maybe I should go answer that question. And even if they're not calling to add a vehicle because of, for a teen driver, they probably will call their insurance company to add their teen driver. And that might be an opportunity for the insurance company to ask, well, we see that your car that's already insured with us, that your teen may be driving, has this feature. Would you like more information? Do you know about it? I'm not sure exactly how the conversation would go. Might be one more touch point to get the parent thinking about that.
Very good point.
To add on to that as well, I think that's an opportunity too to discuss the importance of diversity in message. You mentioned being able to use multimedia platforms, so making sure you're giving people the information in the ways that they receive it. I think it's also important to make sure that you are tailoring the message to the audiences that you want to capture. So there's always an opportunity to dig in on the data and see who's being reflected, who's responding, who understands, and then being able to have some more qualitative conversations to make sure that you are tailoring the message and answering the questions, because information is out there, understanding is growing. We want to make sure that everybody's growing at the same pace and that certain groups or populations aren't missing out on knowing the benefits or also knowing how to interact with that technology when it's inside of the vehicle.
Very good point. Dr. Mueller.
A difficulty with this is identifying what's equipped on which vehicle. Without a universal database that contains the different technologies that are equipped on a specific vehicle, that becomes very, very difficult to facilitate an accurate targeted message. I completely agree with my panelists that the targeted messaging definitely is valuable. Multimedia messaging, absolutely valuable. But to understand the individual audience members, what's on their system, what's on their vehicles, that starts to become really difficult because trim level on an individual model alone, let alone year model, can start to change what's available, what's optionally equipped, and so on. And frankly, people are terrible at understanding what's actually on their vehicle if you ask them directly. So that further muddies the capabilities of being able to identify who has what and how to inform them about technology that either they might not know is on their vehicle, or they might not understand its functional capabilities and limitations. So that's another wrinkle.
Good point. Good point.
Now, it's a very good wrinkle to raise, and I agree that there's a not uniformity and there needs to be a database that's there, but also do want to call out that a lot of marketing and a lot of outreach is hyper-local. And so there is an opportunity for those who have direct contact and interaction with the people who are purchasing the vehicles, having the vehicles serviced, or maybe even doing things very grassroots, pop-ups, things like that, where experts can come and help explain. I think there are creative and innovative solutions that can happen in the meantime, where we see if we can fix that bigger problem of having more information that's readily available in a manner that is at that macro level.
I agree. And I think the knowledge of being aware that this is even an issue can help facilitate those outreach and the grassroots approaches, and also working with the automakers. The automakers have this information, but the trick is, again, to get the information, get the right information. And we start entering a difficult situation, I believe. It was mentioned earlier that, a little bit of knowledge can be actually quite dangerous in terms of people not really understanding how to use a technology appropriately. And that example that was given with the blind spot monitoring and, the over-reliance that you might see as a result of having a little bit of information, but not enough information, and how much is enough. That's also another significant hurdle. And frankly, there probably isn't going to be a single answer. It's probably going to vary hugely from person to person based on their experience, based on their age, based on tech savviness, you name it. There are going to be so many factors that contribute to an individual's receptivity to information, retention of information, and application of information that it's not straightforward.
Very good points brought up. Very good. Okay, well, let's switch gears here a little bit, and I'd like to go to our driver education folks, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Van Tassel and then Benny on this one. You both alluded to this just a little bit in your presentations. What access do driver educators have to vehicles with the latest safety technology? And what opportunities do driver educators have to educate parents about the safety benefit of collision avoidance technology?
Sure. Benny might indeed have the most local perspective there, but it is true that the margins are pretty thin for private driving schools, so they do tend not to buy vehicles chock full of technology. But we have found a couple of manufacturers who are willing to offer driving schools a little bit of a discount on some of those technology packages. So Mazda comes to mind in the past. So I think that's a step forward. Perhaps that could be expanded as well. Also, there seems to be somewhat of a renewed interest on retrofitting vehicles with aftermarket technologies. So depending on the cost there, that might be a possibility. And I think parents would probably appreciate that. That could be a nice differentiator for a driving school that emphasizes the fact that, hey, we also have vehicles with more technology, and we train your son or daughter to use those. And in terms of driving schools reaching parents, a great way to do that is to host parent sessions. And very few states require them, so it's a challenge. And so very few parents show up to those. But those that do are almost always extremely appreciative. They had no idea how the state's licensing procedure actually works, for example. Somehow little Johnny didn't bother to tell the parent how it actually runs. And they're just super thankful for all the resources there. So that could be an easy add in terms of the technology. Hey, when you come to the parent session, if it's in person, bring your owner's manual. We're going to crack those things open and take a look, see what your car actually has, see what they will do and what they won't do. Because manufacturers are very explicit in terms of their limitations. In their owner's manual, they tell you everything right up front.
Benny, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that William was absolutely right. In the driver ed programs, we do tend to use older vehicles. And a lot of times they don't enter into the driver ed programs until they're 3 or 5 years old already. So, a lot of vehicles on the roads, the ones that we're using to teach teens are generally around 10 years old. And, I do think that's pretty close to what most teens end up buying. I know in Michigan, 74% of the teens after they get their license tend to get a vehicle that is over 10 years old, and 35% is over 15 years old. So, parents are not getting teens newer vehicles. And, this is definitely an opportunity of learning on the parents' end, because, I think if you were going to ask a parent if they would have invested more money to keep their teen safe before their kid was in an accident, right, all of them would say yes. And especially in, I'm from Michigan, so we have about 150 cars on our fleet. And I bet I have some of those features. I didn't know about the My Key feature, right? And I bet some of my cars have that feature in them. And so there is a knowledge gap, and there is definitely a lack of resources that we're able to get to parents. And maybe there is a lack of direct communication to the driver educators, because our primary source of information does come from the state, right? We're always looking for those state emails. So if the states are not giving us the information, and it's definitely not going to be boiled down to our parent meetings and to our teen programs for sure. So I do think that there is a lack of communication to driver education programs just in general. And but I do think that, if parents knew about the features out there, I think they would hunt for them, and I think that they would take that into consideration. One thing that we do in Michigan, we get a lot of snow over here, and every year I go on the news and I talk about, hey, maybe you should let your teen use your vehicle for the winter because it's going to be more adapt for keeping you safe. And that is a message that surprises a lot of people, including the hosts, the news hosts, when we give that message out. But it's a message that needs to be given.
Thank you. Anybody else want to join in on this?
Yeah, I think just one point to add. See, the crash avoidance technologies that we're talking about help address vehicle safety. But as Benny was just mentioning, it's important that teen drivers, as well, all drivers, continue to monitor the roadway environment and remain engaged in the driving task, given that the technologies are meant to assist and not necessarily meant to promote or reliance or unsafe behavior behind the wheel, and really getting the resources down at the grassroots level to make sure that the information is standardized and consistent and accurate. And is there a role for NHTSA and other state agencies to help make those available so that all educators, driving schools, DMVs have access to those?
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah,
Dr. Malloy.
One thing I would add too is, one of the difficulties with getting people accustomed to collision avoidance technologies is they're not necessarily going to experience it until they're about to have a collision. And so finding creative ways to show them what happens. So it's not a kind of startle response or, wow, I hadn't seen that before. So I think that's some opportunities.
That's a good point. Dr. Mueller.
I think also one point that's valuable here is to remind parents about what the actual risk factors are about their teens, because many parents will say that their teen is better than their teen's counterparts, and that why should they, have these additional technologies because their teen is so much better than their peers. When the sad truth is, overall, teenage drivers represent a disproportionately at-risk group for crashes. And many of those crashes have risk-taking behavior as contributing factors in those crashes. So I think part of the role is the education component is also to explain these known risk factors, and that to explain, we'd all like to think our children are, special and precious, but, these risk factors are very common among these young new drivers. And this is where, again, these technologies serve to fill a gap in the capabilities, the abilities of these teenage drivers as they're developing foundational skills. And the truth is, these technologies benefit the general population. So it's, again, when it comes to crash avoidance features, these are general gen pop, technologies that are designed to help everyone when they miss a step. However, the teen driver specific technologies are meant to place restrictions around known risk-taking behaviors, and parents should be made aware of what those known risk-taking behaviors are in order to really see the benefits of these technologies and to also buy into the benefit and buy into the technology so that they're using and enforcing the technologies as well, especially the technologies that require parental involvement directly.
Excellent. Very good points by everybody. And I want to direct this next question to Dr. Anderson. As we're hearing, as teens go through driver education, they may or may not have slightly newer cars when they go through this, but it definitely looks like once they get their license, a lot of them are either purchasing or their parents are purchasing much older cars without these safety features. So how do we address the potential equity implications of this?
No, it's a very good question. I think part of it is sort of understanding what the data tells us by being able to dig in to figure out where the issues and challenges are. So we need to understand, is it a situation where the guardian isn't able to educate the teen on what the technology is or how it works? Or is the issue that the fleet that is being used for driver schools are older than the average car out there, or missing some of the technologies there, because that allows us to know what to focus on. Something that's been raised before is education, which is very, very important. Also being able to be aware of how technology works and being exposed to it. But I think something too that we need to talk about in this conversation is access to those vehicles. So just because a car is out there doesn't mean that a parent knows how to purchase it, a guardian is in a position to purchase it, or a teen is in a position to purchase it. And I think that's where public policy, I think that's where advocates, I think that's where researchers all play a role to be able to show, is that what's happening? And if so, let's figure out how to address that issue. As mentioned before, I couldn't imagine any guardian saying that, they wouldn't pay more to make sure that the person who they're watching over is safe. However, there are barriers that we know exist to being able to take action on those things. And so if we identify those barriers and understand what they are, we can then focus on them and target them effectively, either through driver education, either through working with OEMs, is it through working with institutes and organizations that are well-versed in that space. But I think it starts with figuring out sort of what's happening at a very granular level and then being able to devise a strategy for addressing it. Otherwise, we are likely to see the data borne out where you're going to have disproportionate representation of certain groups amongst the groups of teens, in addition to teens continuing to be disproportionately represented. And as mentioned, these technologies are designed to help everybody out on the road. So if I'm a teen and I either don't know how to use the technology in my vehicle or it's not there are going to be implications for other people. So I think it's in all of our benefits to figure out how to dive into this and then figure out what we should do to address it.
Very good. Anybody else have any comments on this?
If I may, this is where voluntary agreements among the auto industry to make certain technology standard, or not just voluntary, but mandated required technologies. We saw this being implemented, rear view cameras, incredibly valuable technologies, especially as the blind spots get larger and larger in newer vehicles. And we know teen drivers struggle with parking, for example. So again, having required technologies in that helps proliferate the fleet, and also reduces cost overall, and also voluntary agreements by making technology standard across models offered by a manufacturer are also valuable ways of reaching a broader consumer base.
Very good.
Yeah, and just to build on that point of voluntary commitments, let's say the industry developed a commitment back in 2016 to deploy automatic emergency braking. So there are opportunities there, but also in looking at the role of NCAP and consumer information programs to drive demand generally among the population, really raising awareness of the availability of the technology. Even at the point of sale, to the extent it might be included on the Monroney label, for example. All of those touch points, I think, are really going to be important, and ensuring that the grassroots component to this will be important to develop that kind of baseline understanding across society about the technology. So regardless of maybe what vehicle that you own at a certain point in time, the materials are there and you're at least familiar generally with how they operate. And obviously the manufacturer will continue to play a role in ensuring that that information is available for owners through the owner's manual or the dealership or other interactive resources that they might make available.
Great.
I think Mr. Scaglione makes a great point with regard to when you have these standards, it allows us to evaluate the technology also. My difficulty for my investigators when they go out and do an investigation is how did it perform? It's like, well, I have no standard to really evaluate that. So it's hard to say what needs to be improved. I think, when we see the board has advocated for rating of collision avoidance systems, because I think when industry is challenged in that way, they rise to that challenge. And now we have, it's rare you see a non-5-star collision crashworthiness rating. We could see that same improvement with collision avoidance technology. And I think then consumers will have a better understanding of what the capabilities of those systems are. So I fully support that.
Thank you for that. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on here just a little bit in the interest of time. And I'd like to basically direct this question towards our educators once again, and maybe I'll start with you, Benny, but there was some talk about complacency using collision avoidance systems with teens, and there's a concern among parents that collision avoidance features will generate complacency among their teen drivers and effectively give their child a license to use their phone or engage in an unsafe behavior. Are you seeing any of this in your driver education at all?
I actually have heard parents say this. These are the same parents, that are insistent on getting their kids a stick shift, which is like even older technology, right? But yeah, I do think that this does exist, but I do think it's maybe a little bit more rare. I think the biggest part of this is the cost factor of, adding another car to your insurance, adding the gas prices, which are rising. I think the cost factor is probably the primary hindrance to them embracing these technologies. And, one thing I think too is that, the stuff that to keep in mind that the things that become standardized today, they might not impact the roads as quickly as we want. But, once these vehicles become the older vehicles, then that's the new standard, right? So there is a sort of delayed satisfaction when it comes to these upgrades. And, as those vehicles get older, assuming that the technologies in them stay good, right? Because, I assume that some of these might have a shelf life. Maybe Paul could speak a little bit to that. In terms of how long the cameras work and how long the sensors work. I'm hoping that it's longer, but as these vehicles age, they're going to become the new startup vehicles. But yeah, I do think it is the cost factor. I have heard parents say that in the past, and I will say that some of the more wealthy areas actually are those same parents that are saying, no, they have to learn in an older vehicle so they develop the habits. And part of that, I think, is to what Alexandra was saying, is that, we have to keep in mind and continue to educate parents that, no, as much as you want them to get that experience, they are going to be at higher risk. They are going to be more prone to risky behaviors. They are going to be more likely to get in an accident due to lack of experience. And the more experience they have, it actually makes them more qualified to drive a vehicle without the safety features, right? Because at some point you become a better driver. So I do think that there needs to be more messaging around that, especially in the parent meetings, which need to be made more available to parents. And I do think driver educators have maybe some outdated means of communication. There are still driving schools out there that send letters to the parents, that get tossed into the trash versus, emails and social media and sending videos out that they watch. So I do think that the more resources that are available to educate parents, the better.
And I would add that indeed parents are right to be concerned about this. We see this behavioral adaptation among adults as well, and teens with their brains that are not yet fully formed are probably even more likely to change their behavior or end up in a habit situation where they're thinking that the technology is going to be used to save their bacon, prevent them from being in a crash rather than viewing themselves as the one in charge, if you will. So it is another opportunity for driver education and other education efforts as well to help parents sort of address the potential risks of collision avoidance technologies in terms of misuse. And it's tricky. Even some of the engineers, I was talking with an engineer a couple of years ago, and he designed, I forget what system it was, on some vehicle, and he was lamenting the fact that, now I got to go back and redesign it because the drivers aren't using it the way that I intended it to be used. And I didn't say this to him directly. I'm like, yeah, I think you skipped a step. In your design, it's called the human element, the human factor. It's humans may not be predictable, but if there's one thing we can predict, a lot of them are going to be looking for an edge or a way to make something work for them immediately, rather than sort of keeping it in the background and hoping that it will save them later and back them up. And maybe another perspective that parents and driving schools could share too is not only can these things help and assist you, I really like that word used earlier, but you might even consider, if these systems activate, that's good feedback to the driver, any driver, that, hey, you may have missed something, that something had to kind of back you up. And that's your sign, oh, gee, I should have been paying more attention, or I can use that as a learning opportunity. So I don't want that to activate again. Yeah, I did not get into a crash, but even better is let's not even get into that situation or that deep into a potential situation.
Good point. Very good
I
point.
think, as Dr. Mueller stated, we generally overestimate our own child's safety. And I think that's where we need to give parents knowledge, and the research that gets conducted. I think, people be surprised how often their kids do use phones, but then, this concept that they're using it now more because the technology, it seems like on the face of it that may be the case, but I think the research could be really beneficial. And then we can then think about, okay, do we need driver monitoring systems when these are in place for teens? So.
Good point. Very good point. This is for everyone. How should parents discuss with their teen driver the safety benefits of collision avoidance systems while also preventing complacency and over-reliance? Anybody want to take that on first?
I think one of the challenges there is getting the parents up to speed on vehicle technologies first, because if we're sort of trusting them to be an additional responsible party to communicate these messaging, for example, a teen may never take driver education, so it sort of completely falls on the parent in that case. And parents did not grow up with these technologies on their vehicles, so they're new to them as well too. So it's maybe even harder for parents to get up to speed. Teens are so comfortable with technology, but it would involve a significant effort on part of parents, and I think we, as a field, can help provide them with information. But once they have it, they're going to have their own discussions. We're kind of out of it at that point, sitting down at the kitchen table. We're not there at home, so hopefully we can equip the parents to do a good job. And when the parent's sitting next to the teen during practice driving, I think that's an additional thing, a new thing that parents should be paying attention to in having those discussions about, in addition to all the other tips and tricks that they're sharing, hopefully, with their teens about that they've learned and that served them well in their driving careers. And hey, let's talk about these technologies, and maybe even have a little discussion. Here's what it was like when we had none of this, no ABS, nothing, just AM radio, and then how things have evolved, and where things are headed, and including what the next couple of years might look like.
Great. Benny?
I agree with that sentiment, and I actually like to play a terrible game sometimes in our classrooms. That is, tell me what your parents are doing wrong behind the wheel. And so we end up in a scenario where the teens are actually gaining the knowledge and are almost more informed than the parents on a lot of things. And it's kind of a reverse education. And so the tough thing is, as you said, is getting the parents on board and educated, because often it works the other way around.
Paul?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned during my introductory presentation, it's never too early to start the conversation. The kids are always absorbing information. They're paying attention to how their parents drive, understand if they're buckling their seatbelt. All of those are important factors. And I think it's also important to mention sort of the crash avoidance technologies, again, that we're talking about are meant to assist and not really change the role of the driver. So being able to talk about the technologies, just generally in terms of the risk factors, wear your seatbelt, don't speed. They're kind of complementary with one another. It's just making sure that the resources are available to connect the dots. And NHTSA has a number of insightful resources available, but really sort of identifying a way to have a direct conversation about safe driving habits, providing constructive feedback, and how technology can play a role in supporting that.
Okay, great. Dr. Mueller? Oh.
Good.
Nadia was before me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Anderson.
No, thanks. Just wanted to double click a little bit on what Paul was mentioning about focusing on the teen itself and teen themselves and not starting too early. So making sure that you are messaging directly to them and also meeting them where they are and figuring out sort of what moves the needle. Dr. Van Tassel mentioned before that sometimes the direct safety messaging may not be the most effective. Maybe there's something related to the environment. Maybe there's something related to a social cause, but figuring out what that is and then being able to message there. I think the other piece too is definitely not leaving the guardian out of the equation, making sure that they too understand, but also providing them with the tools that they need to have that conversation with the teen or the novice driver about what to expect, what to experience, and then framing it under that messaging of this technology is supposed to supplement you. Like you as a human are in control, but making sure that you're paying attention to when you're getting cues so you can learn and get better, but also knowing how the technology can help you as you navigate that experience.
Excellent. Okay, now Dr. Mueller.
Well, actually, it was just said really well, but just a reminder that, these technologies have a purpose. And so back to what we were talking about at the beginning, to understand the risk factors, understand why these technologies are being put in the vehicle in the first place. Also to properly shape expectations around system performance, about system functionality, but also to emphasize that, again, this is not a replacement of the driver. And inevitably, the driver will experience a situation in which the system cannot intervene enough or even at all, depending on the complexity of the situation happening. Again, these technologies are generally designed for very specific crash scenarios, and the world we live in is very random, very chaotic, and very complex. So sometimes these systems will have difficulty to respond as optimally as we would like them to. And so again, it's not a replacement of the driver, it's an assistive feature to help supplement the driver, especially when the driver is known to have difficulty for very specific aspects of the driving task. So really it's about also explaining why the technology matters in order to garner acceptance and to motivate both the parents and the teenagers to use systems and again, not to address over reliance and the possibility that that can happen. And so again, knowledge about purpose, knowledge about the driver's roles, and knowledge about the fact that these systems are not perfect and cannot drive the vehicle themselves. I think that's also a very key component to everything else that's been raised.
Very good point. Very good point. Yeah, and Dr. Van Tassel.
I think another opportunity that the parents can take is going beyond anything that is offered education-wise from driver education or parent sessions, and seek out other opportunities. For example, training that might be offered by a vehicle retailer, new car, used car, either one. I know of a lady who lived up in the Northeast, and she and her husband were going to be purchasing a new car. They picked it out. It was chock full of technology. It was a Tuesday night, and the dealer said, okay, we'll do the deal. You can drive it home, bring it back Saturday morning, and we've got a half-day class. We will teach you everything about every bit of this vehicle. We'll help you pair your phone. We'll show you all these vehicle technologies. We'll take you out on the road and show you how these work, demonstrate them for you, and we'll even give you lunch. And then by noon, 12:30, you're on your way. Her response, I don't have time for that in my life right now. So in that case, the dealer is making a good faith effort to deliver there, to make sure that the new user of that vehicle knew all about it. And yet it was the buyer, in this case, the parent, who was the barrier. So we don't want parents to be barriers. We want them to be sponges, because it could actually make a life and death difference when their teen gets into that vehicle.
Good on the dealer on that. All right, we need to move on here. I'm going to question here. What are the researchers, automakers, and educators, in what ways are you factoring equity and accessibility into the advancement of collision avoidance technology? And I'll leave that out there for anybody to jump on first. Are any of you, is anybody out there doing that? I guess we have some work, Dr. Anderson, don't we? Do you want to address that, Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, I'll just say that the research is evolving for sure when it comes to understanding how people are interacting with technology, what best practices are, what's there, and it's definitely a gap in the research. And just to echo what I said in the presentation, as policy people, as researchers, as academics, what we do is identify where there are gaps in our learning and understanding, and we work to fill it. So there's clearly a gap here, and there's clearly more that we can do. And there's a lot of energy and excitement around actually looking at this issue and tackling it in different ways. So I'm excited for our next panel that comes. We can answer that question again, and everybody will be able to say, we're now doing this in order to make sure that we have those extra layers and lenses into our practice.
Absolutely. Very good. All right. I know we're coming up on the hour here, so I want to give everybody a chance, each one of our panelists, from your perspective, what is one tangible action or takeaway you would like to share from this discussion? And I'm just going to go down a list here. Dr. Mueller, you're up first.
Again, speaking to the presentation that I gave, I think it's going to be safer for me to just stick into that lane at the moment. But really, it's about understanding that these technologies do have the potential to improve the traffic safety of teenage drivers. And in order to even start to see those benefits, people need to use these technologies. There needs to be broader acceptance. The barriers that we've been identifying in this Q&A need to be addressed in order for teen drivers in particular to benefit from these technologies. And the technologies themselves are going to change. They're going to grow in sophistication. The proliferation of the technology is going to continue through the vehicle fleet into the secondhand market and so on. So over time, teenage drivers are going to come into more contact with these technologies. And it's, again, how do we prepare the teenagers and their guardians, their parents, so that they're best poised to benefit from these technologies.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mueller. Let's go with Paul Scaglione.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the main takeaway for me is really sort of emphasizing education. Looking again to emphasize the importance of safe driving behavior and leading by example, particularly with restraint use and speeding, but also education around the crash avoidance technology and awareness of how those systems function, as well as the role of the driver, and how those can support teen drivers as they develop their skills. And then finally, related to education, integrating that as part of the driver skills training to help broaden that awareness. So it's not sort of a single point of information, but it's more commonly known, particularly as the new generation of drivers comes through.
Great, thank you for that. Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, I think for me, the main takeaway is that there is absolutely a top-down and a bottoms-up approach when it comes to addressing teen driver safety, but also understanding the technology question and how they'll be interacting with collision avoidance systems. I think there also is a lot of opportunity for engagement with academics and researchers, those who are at the cutting edge and positioned to kind of dig into the data and what's happening, even if it's at a very hyper-local point of view and perspective, because I think there are tons of learnings and best practices that will be generally applicable to the problem and issue that we're trying to address. And then just, again, there's lots of value in collaborating, having these conversations and making sure that different points of views, cuts of data and perspectives are raised as we all work towards solutions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Anderson. Let's go with Dr. Van Tassel.
Two things come to mind. Obviously, we have some work to do in the equity and access realm. So looking forward to advancing that. And also, at least in the education arena, maybe try and reduce the friction of trying to bring all the resources that we can to bear on teen drivers, whether it's parents, local driving school issues such as more modern training vehicles and instructors who are prepared for that. Just trying to bring all that together. And it's still a tough fight. Maybe there are things we can do to make that a little bit easier to bring it all together.
Great. Benny Malberg.
Yeah, I think that, one of the biggest things that could be out there for at least driving schools and, the people on the ground that are teaching the lessons and getting this type of information across is more direct communication, and different methods of getting that information to driving schools, I think is huge. And I do know that, AAA has put together the new technology in the curriculum. But as he mentioned, that's not, added to the mandated curriculum that the states are requiring us to use. And when you only have so much time to talk about driver education, you better believe that's probably the first thing that is nixed from the agenda, because you only have so much time with these students in order to get the information across. So I also think there probably needs to be flexibility or a good look at the GDL process and, the time in most states, if this is going to be addressed on the driver education level. Otherwise, I think that you're kind of going to see the same stuff happening over and over, which is, hey, we only have 30 hours to talk, and we're going to prioritize the stuff that we're mandated to talk about.
Very good. And I think our last one is Dr. Malloy.
Thank you very much. I strongly believe in the promise of collision avoidance technologies. That's why we have it on our most wanted list. And despite all of the great advances we've seen already, we're heading in the wrong direction with fatalities. So I think we need to take that as a cry to even do more, at the federal level, challenge the development of these systems by putting out ratings and evaluating these systems appropriately. And I think the research that's being done by the group here will help us guide moving the education forward. So we all know that these are not just systems for the poor driver, but they're systems for all of us.
Good point. Thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for being such a great panel, and what an incredible discussion we've had. You can go ahead and turn off your cameras now and mute your microphones. And I want to thank all of our amazing panelists once again for your presentations and participation in today's discussion. I also wanted to thank everyone behind the scenes who helped put this webinar together. Collision avoidance technology and teen-specific driver features have tremendous potential to reduce the human cost of traffic crashes. I hope that today's program has given you insight of the power of these technologies. Parents, if you're looking for a new vehicle, please consider one equipped with forward collision warning and automatic emergency braking systems. Parents and teens who have collision avoidance technology in your car, learn how your systems work and understand the limitations. As we heard throughout the afternoon, regulators, educators, and automakers are also responsible to educate the public, parents, and teen drivers on this important technology, and to improve the availability and accessibility of these safety systems to all. Our young people are the future. All of us, whether a parent or guardian, educator, automaker, researcher, or regulator, it is our responsibility to set a positive example for our teen drivers and make sure they embark on their on-road journey with the best technology to foster safety. To learn more, look for this topic at www.ntsb.gov on the Advocacy tab under Most Wanted list. There you will find more information on connected vehicles and collision avoidance technology. Thank you for tuning in to our collision avoidance technology and teen driver safety webinar. Together, we can save lives.